Hello, everybody. Wanted to come in here for the second video here of this little civil rights series, I guess is what you would call it, due to the ongoing little national crisis over after the unfortunate death of George Floyd. So I wanted to get in with the second topic video. This will probably be the only topic video I think for this week. I'm trying to move it a little slowly, space it out through here through June until it's time to do the upcoming American Revolution one. So this will probably be the only one for this week. Now, this video and the last video, we covered the topic of slavery in the United States, which ended in 1865 with the end of the Civil War and the addition of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery once and for all. Now, this video, we shall cover the topic of Reconstruction, the years immediately following the Civil War, in which we tried to rebuild and re-educate the South, and unfortunately, it turned up to be a disaster due to lack of federal enforcement and a kind of white supremacist movement that really wasn't gone away in the South, and it was too strong for the federal government to really counter unless they used force, which for some reason they didn't want to seem to. So Reconstruction is the period immediately following the Civil War. It lasted from 1865 at the Civil War's end until 1877 when the withdrawal of federal troops was finally taken out of the rest of the southern states. And during this period, we had a lot of acts done by Congress to try to help African Americans that were now free to gain their citizenship, to gain their right to vote, to ensure that they had equal justice under the law, and to also kind of punish the southern states in a way as well for their traitorous act during the war, not during the Civil War. So it was kind of and also rebuilding the South. The South was devastated after the Civil War. Its economy was wrecked, especially with the plantation system no longer effective due to that slavery is now illegal and abolished. Plantations relied on slave labor. Without slaves, the big plantations of the antebellum South can no longer properly function. So the South's economy was really wrecked after the war. So this is what we're going to cover. Now, hold on here. Actually, I gotta get my notebook here a second. I forgot where I put it. Where did I put my notebook? Oh, do hold on here a second. I know where I put it. Never mind. Found it finally. The big historical archive of knowledge. Found the wonderful notebook. Now, where do we look? Ah, here. A wonderful notebook. Anyway. Slap it over here. Anyway, we basically, as I mentioned, it's the efforts that are focusing on reintegrating the southern states back into the United States, and also to help the now newly freed 4 million former slaves that are now freed in the country. African Americans are now free. There's no more slavery in this country. It's abolished. So where we got to look? We got to actually look during the Civil War when it was going on, and this is going to go to about 1863, right during the middle of the war, like the year that Gettysburg happened. So on January 1st of 1863, as we covered in the last video, President Abraham Lincoln enacted formally his Emancipation Proclamation formally goes into effect. Now this proclamation, as we mentioned, it freed all slaves in any territory that was in open rebellion against the United States. So any territory that was still in Confederate hands, all the slaves that lived on that territory were free. That did not include the border states that were still in the Union but allowed slavery, and it also did not include areas of the Confederacy already occupied by the Union, such as most of Tennessee and part of Louisiana. So we mentioned that. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment was passed in December of 1865 that slavery was formally abolished everywhere in the country. Now, slavery, again, had become the main cause of the war, and abolition had become the main Union goal during the war. Excuse me. Now, many people believed that slaves were content with bondage prior to the Civil War. Many Southerners in particular believed this. They thought that the slaves were happy, that they were content with being the way things were, that they were content and they were happy with being slaves. And this was especially held in the South, of course, by the ignorant, same people that wanted to uphold the policy. What is wrong with you people that you would ever think that someone would be content with being whipped and beaten and worked to death? What makes you think that they'd be content with that? Only the warped mind of the devil would make you think that. Well, this rapidly changed after the war, especially due to the fact that as we had mentioned, over 180,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army during the Civil War and fought in it. Of course, if they were on the battlefield, they received a far more gruesome death. But the fact kind of got jolted in the Southerners' minds. Well, if the black man is so content with being a slave, why is he rising in open rebellion against us? There's no reason that he would be doing that unless they're not content with being slaves. Wow, we are actually getting smart here. Wow, Southerners, you really got a noggin. Starting to click. And by Southerners, I mean past Southerners. I don't mean today. Just to verify that. I have very much respect for our Southern cousins. In fact, I actually have a certain high respect for them, because as much as I don't like what the Confederacy stand for, as much as I do not like it at all, what it stood for, what it fought for, as much as I do respect the Southern states, even though I consider what they did treason. And if I had been Lincoln, I probably would have went to war too. I have a very much respect to them because, and I'm going to put this bluntly, they had the balls to go against the federal government. Not too many people have that. I myself, not sure I would have that. So, although what they did was treasonous, and although what they were fighting for was wrong, I have a certain respect for it, only due to the factor it takes a lot of guts to go against the United States government. It really does. So, the fact that they were willing to go to that degree, yes, it was bad, but I also have a small respect. The South, to my knowledge, is the only area in this nation to ever go to that degree. So it was not for a good cause, but they had the balls to do it. Just wanted to get that out there. But anyway, now Lincoln had, during the war, he tried to create a plan for what he called Reconstruction, or the rebuilding of the South after the war. What were they going to do? Because by that point, after 1863, it became evident the South was going to lose the war. It was only a matter of time. So now the question became not if the Union's going to win the war, but how are we going to rebuild the country after this war's over? Mainly, how are we going to reintegrate the South and the newly freed slaves back into the nation? And Lincoln, although he tried multiple times to come up with a plan, by April of 1865, when he would be assassinated, he still had no concrete plan yet developed for the process. And mind you that not only is Lincoln assassinated in April of 1865, but the Confederacy is basically done by April of 1865. Richmond falls, Lee surrenders, Johnston surrenders. It's the end. Well, on April 11th, just days before his assassination, Lincoln was actually speaking about Reconstruction in Louisiana. He was not in Louisiana. He was speaking about the Reconstruction process going on in Louisiana, since it was already mostly under Union occupation and federal authorities already had a large majority of control in Louisiana. And Lincoln had proposed that some blacks, mainly free men and ones who had enlisted in the military, be allowed to vote after the war. Now, unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated just 3 days later on April 14th, as we covered in one of our prior videos, which I will provide a small link to at the end of this video if you should want to watch that. And now the task of Reconstruction with Lincoln's death falls to Andrew Johnson. And may I add that Lincoln's death was actually kind of a bad thing for the South, because Lincoln had, during his second inaugural address, Lincoln had kind of expressed his desire to heal the country and bind the country's wounds. He wanted to have a quick and peaceful Reconstruction. Lincoln did not believe that the North should have to be radically harsh on the South. He wanted the Southern states to be able to return, but he also wanted to give the black man rights. Now, with Lincoln dead, that changes things, because now you got Lincoln's vice president, who we're going to say here in a minute, and a radical Republican Congress full of radical Republicans who are adamant about punishing the South for the entire war. Even the president of the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, had even acknowledged after hearing that Lincoln had been shot that although he had no special love for Mr. Lincoln, he had deemed that Lincoln's death was a tragedy for their area/country, whatever you want to call it, because he did realize that with Lincoln dead, there was nothing to stop the radical Republicans in the U.S. Congress from pursuing a more punishing Reconstruction upon the South. And Lincoln's successor was his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson himself is going to have a conflict with Congress because Congress is full of radical Republicans. Johnson is a Southerner. Now, you're probably looking at me right now and you're saying, wait a minute, Johnson's a Southerner, or how is he U.S. vice president? Well, Johnson had been he was a senator from his home state of Tennessee. Now, Johnson, when Tennessee seceded from the United States, Johnson refused to secede as well. He refused to join the Confederacy. He remained loyal to the Union. In fact, he was the only Southern senator from a Southern state to remain in the United States Senate. He was the only one to remain loyal and not join the Confederacy. And Lincoln rewarded him in 1864 when he ran for re-election. He wanted to even out his ballot ticket to try to convey to the South and to the nation that he wanted to bind up the nation's wounds. Well, how about we get Lincoln as president, which he's running for re-election. He's from the North. He's from Illinois. And let's get a Southerner on the vice presidential part on the ballot. That way to try to have North and South together on the ballot, which, of course, helps in Lincoln's re-election, and Johnson becomes vice president when Lincoln takes his second oath of office in March of 1865. Now, Johnson was also kind of a drunk. He actually got drunk at his inauguration. He slurred his speech, made a mess out of the inauguration speech, and embarrassed about everyone there. And not only was he a Southerner, but Johnson was not exactly all for the African-American person. He was not, like any Southerner, he had his prejudices toward black people. And that's going to kind of come in conflict now with the radical Republicans that are in Congress. In May of 1865, a month after he takes office due to Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson, as he is now, he announces his official plans for Reconstruction and what we're going to call Presidential Reconstruction, because there's actually two phases here, and this is the first, and this is kind of the shortest and lenient. Now, under his Presidential Reconstruction, Johnson basically instructed that all land that had been taken by the Union Army during the war, or even given to freed slaves, as they were called, freedmen, were to be returned to the pre-war owners, no matter who that was, which in most cases was a white plantation owner. Yeah, you see a problem here? I see a problem. Keep in mind, Johnson is from the South, so he's kind of sympathetic to his countrymen in the South. He's sympathetic to them because he understands their economy. And Johnson even went on kind of record, before we get further here, he went on record during his presidency that he was not fighting for the blacks in the Congress. He was not, or he actually turned them another word, but I am not saying that word. I think you can guess what that word is. Well, Johnson had stated he wasn't fighting for the blacks in Congress. He was fighting the traitorous aristocrats, the plantation owners who had started the Civil War. That's who he was fighting. He wasn't fighting for them. I'm pretty sure as president of the United States, you should at least be fighting for the newly freed African Americans in your country. If you don't, that's a problem. Anyway, the southern states, according to Presidential Reconstruction, the southern states would be required to abolish slavery, which is now required due to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. They must swear loyalty to the Union. We swear the loyalty. And they must pay off their own war debt. And what I say by that is, during the war, the Confederate States had kind of incurred a debt from certain foreign builders, especially in Britain, for them building some commerce raiders to try to break through the naval blockade around the Confederacy that the Union had. And they had incurred a debt to those companies. Well, when the Civil War ends, the United States ain't too happy to learn that foreign nations tried to help their rebellious southern part. So they kind of state immediately after the end of the war, well, we're not taking on the Confederacy's debt because we didn't recognize them. So those countries that had debt to the Confederacy, if you want it, you're going to have to haggle the individual states because the federal government is not taking care of it. In most cases, the states actually didn't pay off their debt, and the debt was forgiven by those nations because they just didn't want to haggle with the stuff. It was kind of not only to punish the South, but it was also to kind of punish like Great Britain and France in particular, who had kind of had some diplomatic relations with the Confederacy, and the United States was sort of wanting to say, don't mess with us. Don't get involved in our affairs. Well, but there's a problem with Presidential Reconstruction, and that was, other than these small things, such as they had to abolish slavery, they had to swear loyalty, they had to pay off their own debt, other than those things, the southern states were pretty much largely free to reign themselves on basically how Reconstruction was going to go. It was basically free reign. Basically, okay, you do these few things, and then you can determine how the rest goes yourselves. I wouldn't be doing that. The South is just... Let me put this into terms here. A lot of Southerners did not, even though not every one of them had slaves, there were a lot of them who did not believe that the black man was equal to the white man. White supremacy. Even though a lot of them had not had slaves, white supremacy was very evident in the South. And if you let the southern states be able to dictate the Reconstruction terms on their own, well, I can almost guarantee you they're going to probably try and restrict the rights of black people. We can't have them as legal slaves anymore, but we will do anything we can to try to limit their rights, to try to still ensure they do not have the same power as whites do. And guess what? This is exactly what happens. So basically, what happens here is, due to Johnson's leniency in his presidential reconstruction, most of the southern states start adopting what are called black codes. And these black codes are simple little things of laws that between 1865 and 1866, they start restricting the rights and movements and the activities of these newly freed African Americans. It starts basically trying to put them in a hold similar to slavery, although it was slavery in everything but name, basically. We're still restricting your rights. We're still not giving you things. Did you not learn anything from the Civil War? And I hate to say it, but even today, there's some Southerners who really still haven't learned anything from the Civil War. There's still some racists in this country who haven't learned anything from the Civil War. And I'm not saying they're from the South either. They're in the North. They're in the West. They're everywhere. But anyway, may I just point, the Civil War, I want to state this again, because I know there's deniers out there. The Civil War, either way you put it, was about slavery. I don't care what you tell me. I don't care if you try to tell me, oh no, it was about fighting a federal government. It was about fighting for freedom. It was about states' rights. Now, the federal government may have been encroaching on certain freedoms. I will acknowledge that. But the only freedom they were truly encroaching on was what Southern slaveholders, who were the main politicians and power holders in the South, were fearing, and that was their right to have slaves. They fought a war over slavery, whether you want to admit it or not. Oh, you'll sit here and tell me, you'll blame me, you'll call me everything else in the book. I've seen it on other YouTube videos. But guess what? You want to sit there in denial about it? That's your problem. I can only tell you things, but I cannot change your mind. But I just want to make that very clear now. One way or another, it goes there. And then, I want to put this little argument too. Oh, there were There were blacks that fought for the Confederacy. Well, yes, there was. I will acknowledge that. But guess what? That wasn't until the very end of the war because the Confederacy was so racist that it didn't even want to put a black in a uniform. It didn't. And may I also point that when they did this, they were usually slaves and they were forced to do so. And may I add this part, that most of those slaves, they're in the middle of a battle, they ran off and joined the Union. They abandoned the South. Don't try to pull that crap that, oh, they fought for the South too. Yeah, forcefully. And guess what? They didn't stay long either, did they? Think about that for next time you try to claim that it was about states' rights, because either way you go about it, states' rights, yeah, the right to own slaves. I don't care what way you put about this. It was about slavery. There is, I don't know how many things. I mean, my goodness, the cornerstone speech that was given by Alexander Stephens of Georgia, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. May I add that this speech basically stated explicitly that they believed that the white man was superior to the Negro, as they put it. That's not what I say it. That's what they say. I do apologize if that offends anybody, but that is what they said. But anyway, yeah, don't tell me this. There is every bit of evidence to support that the South was fighting for slavery. If you cannot come to terms with that, get out of this country. I cannot explain that any more. That I cannot emphasize that. It strains my mind there are people who sit here and try to deny it. Your past is not all glorifying. But anyway, these codes basically they make the black African Americans dependent on the Southern landowners once again for everything, and this starts enraging the people in the North, especially the radical Republicans in Congress, who basically see you're letting the South off easy, and they're going right back to it. You got to punish them. Well, Congress, in reaction to this, they refuse to admit any of the elected Southern congressmen, now that elections are being held in the South again, they refuse to seat any of them because they're enforcing black codes, said, you still haven't come to the terms that we told you to do. And they even passed the Freedmen's Bureau and Civil Rights Act in 1866 that is sent for Johnson to sign. Now, what is this act? Well, these acts extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government organization that helped to assist newly freed African Americans, or the former slaves, as you want to call them, what you will. It helped to settle them in land areas, get their own plots of land, help educate them, because during slavery, they weren't even allowed to learn anything. Well, and it also, in the Civil Rights Act, defined that all people born in the United States were national citizens. And since most slaves had been born in the United States, since the slave trade had been outlawed in 1808, I think, most slaves had been born in the United States. That made them citizens. Well, Johnson vetoed both bills, being his racist little self. And this leads to a growing rift that occurs between him and Congress. Eventually, he actually gets impeached. Johnson becomes the first president to be impeached in 1868 due to the growing rift that eventually occurs. Now, it's over a separate issue, which one day we'll probably do a video on it, but he eventually gets impeached, and he actually almost gets removed from office. They lack one vote. When they vote, they're short by one vote to convict and remove him. Well, Congress overrides the vetoes that Johnson gives the bills, and they passed the law anyway. So this goes into effect in 1866. And just for a side fun fact here, this is actually the first time that a congressional law has been that congressional leaders have actually overridden a presidential veto in the United States history is in 1866. Now, many of the Northerners start rejecting and disapproving of Johnson's Presidential Reconstruction policies, and they start believing that he's starting to let the South off easy more than it should be, that they need to be punished. Well, due to this, the radical Republicans in Congress start enlarging their majority in Congress due to the elections because Northerners are no longer approving of Johnson, so what are they going to do? We'll start strengthening Congress with these radical Republicans. And in 1866 elections, they actually took control of Reconstruction. And after the 1866 elections, Congress takes control of the Reconstruction process. So that is the end of presidential Reconstruction. Now we're getting to radical Reconstruction. This is where we're going to start punishing the South, in a way. In 1867, even though Johnson vetoes it, as their first act of radical Reconstruction, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act. This dictates how Reconstruction is going to go basically the rest of the way. Now, the act temporarily divides the South into 5 military districts and even outlines the process for how new state governments are to be formed that allow all male citizens, regardless of their race or color, to vote in elections, how they are to be created. And they also state that no southern state is going to come back until that happens. And they also state southern states would also be required to ratify the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which has been passed, before they could even rejoin the Union. Now, what is the 14th Amendment? Now, although slavery has been abolished in the South, many states had passed those black codes trying to restrict their rights. Well, now Congress passes the 14th Amendment, which goes into effect in 1870, although it had been passed in 1869. Now, the 14th Amendment, actually, no, that's the 15th. Hold on. The 14th Amendment guaranteed the citizenship issue to African Americans. All African Americans that had citizenship in this country, they all had citizenship. So now southern states, before they can even be readmitted, they have to ratify that in order to prove that, guess what? Blacks are citizens. And that kind of causes a little bit of contention. In February of 1869, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which is adopted in 1870, the following year. And this guarantees a citizen's right to vote, and this is in the words of that amendment, regardless of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Basically, former slaves and African Americans have the right to vote just like white men. May I add that? It was only men. Only white men and black men could vote. No women. Didn't matter if you were white or black. If you were a woman, you could not vote. That would not happen until 1920. Now, here's a very fun fact. The 15th Amendment, since it was not required for Confederate states to have to ratify that amendment in order to rejoin, a lot of them rejoined the Union without ratifying the 15th Amendment. They ratified the 14th, but not the 15th. That would guarantee them the right to vote. And Nevada was the first state to ratify the 15th Amendment in 1870 when it was adopted. Well, 1869 when it was passed. It had to be ratified before it was adopted. And the last state to actually ratify the 15th Amendment was the state of Tennessee. But here's the catcher. Tennessee did not ratify the 15th Amendment until 1997. Yeah, we're talking just 23 years ago. That's sad. And by 1870, all of the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union. Now, may I add that some of them had resistance, such as Georgia in particular. Georgia was set to be readmitted to the Union in 1868. However, their new state constitution did not include a protection of the 14th Amendment, and Georgia refused to ratify it. So the federal government says, well, guess what? Until you ratify that, you aren't joining. So while a bunch of other southern states get to rejoin that year, Georgia gets pushed back until 1870, until July of 1870. Georgia is actually the last state to rejoin the Union out of the Confederate States because of this. And is it any coincidence this is the same state from which Alexander Stephens, author of the Cornerstone speech that basically said that white men are superior to black men, came from? Is this any coincidence? I don't think so. And as we're talking about districts here in the South, I want to put this up. The little map here of the former Confederate states and the districts that were set up. They were under military occupation by an appointed U.S. Army general, and the federal troops were there to enforce the new laws that were considered under the Reconstruction Act and basically ensure that blacks could vote like they could, that their rights were being observed. And we had 5 districts set up. Now, only one Confederate state was not included in any district, and that was Tennessee. Tennessee, during the Civil War, within just 2 years, had been largely occupied by the Union Army, and thus, by the time the Civil War ended, it had already been under Union control for a while. So Tennessee was really kind of already basically, how should we put this? It was already basically repaired and reconstructed by the time the Civil War ended, due to how fast the Union occupied the state. Now, the rest of them got put in districts. Virginia was the first district. It was on its own in the first district. North and South Carolina were in district number 2. Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were district number 3. Mississippi and Arkansas, or Arkansas, I don't know how they say it, was district number 4, and Louisiana and Texas were district number 5. So this were the districts that we divided them in. The only one not included was Tennessee. It was unoccupied with federal troops. There was no federal troops there because of the fact that it was already largely reconstructed by the time the Civil War ended. And that reflected in the readmission process here that we're going to go over here shortly. And just so we know, right here is a picture of the wonderful racist president, Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's second vice president and who became president upon his death and was also the first president to be impeached. He only served 1 term. I wonder why. Also, may I add this, that Johnson was also at odds because of the factor radical Republicans gained control in Congress. Democrats during the war had been kind of their base had been in the South. A lot of Democrats were from the South. And a lot of them had just been seditious during the war, trying to say, oh, you need to quit it, you just need to recognize the South. And Johnson was a Democrat. Yeah, Democrats and Republicans still don't get along. So you got a Democratic president with a Republican-dominated Congress. Ain't going to work out well. Plus, it don't help that you're a Southerner. And you're trying to reconstruct the South, and that's going to go everywhere. So anyway, as we get here, I also want to touch on when the states were readmitted. And as I mentioned, how Tennessee had been unoccupied and been reconstructed largely, well, this reflects in the order of readmission because Tennessee actually becomes the first state to be readmitted, and it's the earliest, too. And keep in mind, the Civil War ended in 1865. Well, Tennessee is readmitted just 1 year later in 1866. The second state to be readmitted was Arkansas, or Arkansas. I do apologize if I'm not saying it right. I don't know how they say it because I've heard Arkansas, but I've always called it Arkansas. And that is in 1868. In fact, the rest of them are in 1868, but I'm saying them in order. North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, all 18. Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, all 1868. Now, Georgia would have been had it been cooperating, and it wasn't, so it got delayed. And it was not until 1870 that the last of the states were admitted. Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia, all 1870. Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia were in 1870. All the Confederate states had been readmitted within 5 years after the end of the Civil War. Now, of all the new state constitutions in the South during the radical Reconstruction period were actually extremely progressive in their nature. They did actually have certain protections for African Americans. African Americans' participation in public life even increased after 1867 when Congress had kind of took over Reconstruction from Johnson. Blacks voted in elections, and several blacks even managed to be elected to positions in state governments and even Congress. You had, for example, Hiram Revels, I don't know how they say him, was voted in as the senator for Mississippi in 1870. He was the first African-American congressman. He was in the U.S. Senate. He was a senator from Mississippi. You can look him up if you wanted to. I forgot to grab a photo of him, so I do apologize. Reconstruction, however, it achieved smaller tasks. It wasn't just ensuring that blacks had their citizenship. It wasn't just ensuring that African Americans could have the right to vote. It was smaller things, like rebuilding the South. So taxation is going to be a big thing. You got to rebuild the South, so you can't really afford to tax them real heavily. They got to save their income a little bit. And this includes equitable taxation laws that are passed especially in the country, especially to help out the South. There's economic development programs to try to help rebuild the Southern economy, which has been devastated after the war. It has to kind of reshift its focus because the plantations are no longer a thing, really. Racial discrimination laws and public transportation, such as railroads at the time, I guess, was the main transportation. And even the creation of the first state-funded public schools in the South that were both you had ones for white children, and then you had the ones that were trying to educate the former slaves and the African Americans that were trying to educate them, since they had never learned anything. So there was a host of smaller yet beneficial programs that were also brought up by Reconstruction. It wasn't all just voting rights and citizenship. Now, all this sounds good, but as we mentioned, it was ultimately a failure. And that's where we're going to have to start getting into the bad stuff for Reconstruction. And it's not even Johnson. I mean, it gets worse for him. After 1867, after Congress kind of takes over, more and more Southern whites began to turn into violence, basically, in resentment of Reconstruction. They start resenting Congress taking over. In fact, that they start calling a lot of these Northern people that are coming down to help educate, to help enforce the laws and everything, they start calling them carpetbaggers and scallywags. Now, many white Southerners and former Confederate soldiers, as we mentioned, white supremacy is very high in the South at this time. Even they know they can't have slavery anymore, but they are determined to do so by any means necessary to stop the African American person from having the same rights as the white man. And a lot of white Southerners, and this included a lot of the former Confederate soldiers, they start forming militia groups, and they start committing violence against blacks, against Republicans, against any white people that were helping with Reconstruction, against basically anyone that challenged white authority, be it a black, be it a Republican, be it anyone. And as I know this is a touchy subject here, and I don't like talking about this one, but I gotta mention it because of how crucial it was at that time, how bad of a thing it was. Of all these groups that occurred, the most famous and the most probably horrific one is none other than the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, which, as we all probably know, it's still in existence today. It's not the very same one that was in existence back then. I think, to my knowledge, they've had like a couple of revivals, and this Klan actually died out. But this was the first time that the KKK came into existence, and it was solely made up mostly of former Confederates and white plantation owners who wanted to do anything they could to stop African Americans from gaining their rights and their citizenship. Ooh, apologize. I had to pick something off the floor. Now, the KKK was very similar. This KKK version was very similar to the old slave patrols that had been in the South prior to the Civil War, that had kind of committed violence against slaves or black people that had been free. And however, they weren't sanctioned by the law. Prior to the Civil War, slave patrols were part of the law. And on top of that, there was laws against what you could do to a slave because they were considered property. And now there's not. Slavery's gone. In their minds, there's nothing that can stop them from committing an act against them like they would do if they were murdering a white person. And this causes them to commit a lot of horrible violent acts. And I'm sure you can probably guess what some of these are. I'm not holding up any photos, no. Now, the Klan members commonly would ride out at night, and they would ride out on horseback during the middle of the night. And they would basically travel to rob, intimidate, or even just attack any African Americans, Republican politicians, or just common Southerners who were helping and cooperating with Reconstruction. But they would especially target African Americans and Republican leaders in the South. And they would go to their houses and basically threaten them at gunpoint. They would attack them, they'd beat them, they'd whip them, they'd lynch them. Yeah, they would lynch. That horrible thing that I don't even want to even think about. They would do that. And the Klan members would make blacks sign land contracts. They would go around to their houses, threaten them at gunpoint, make them sign a contract that would bind them to be forced to work someone's plantation or face violence, saying, okay, either you're going to work for this farmer and do his land, or you're going to get killed. It was basically threatening and coercing them into basically going back to slavery. It was trying to reinstill them as plantation workers. Now, the Klan here's the bad thing, though. The Klan often received support from local white landowners and even the state government officials. And because of this, they became very widespread throughout the South starting in 1870. They became so widespread in the South that they were everywhere. And all this violence was happening nonstop. Not to mention, not only was there KKK violence, you had riots breaking out in big cities like Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana, where whites were kind of uprising against Republicans or African Americans just because they didn't approve of the laws. And Democrats, I hate to chastise and get into politics here, but Democrats did their part in this too, because they wanted to regain power in the South, and they started supporting and inciting these riots. Yeah, it really looks good, Democrats, on your record. Now, don't be thinking that I'm attacking liberals here, because I can go just as much on the Republicans. In fact, I will do so right here. Yeah, the Democrats supported the South, but keep in mind the Republicans didn't have the balls to keep Reconstruction going. Keep that in mind. They gave up. Now, as we mentioned, the Klan often would receive support, and because of this, there was nothing to stop them from committing these horrible acts such as rape, beatings, lynchings, and outright murder without any resistance from the law enforcement of the state government. They were doing this like they had free reign and almost total control in the South. And because of this, many blacks started not to vote because they were being intimidated into not voting, because they were being threatened. And if you want to see a cartoon here that was made because of this, to show the rising white supremacy that's growing in the South, first I'll show you this image. This is an image of several African Americans, well, the drawing, African Americans in New Orleans actually voting for the first time after the Civil War. And then right here, this is a cartoon driven by the political cartoonist Thomas Nast, and it's kind of illustrating how horrible it was getting in the South. And you got this. You have a former white Southerner militiaman who's one of these white supremacist groups holding hands with a member of the KKK, and they're destroying everything. They're destroying the schools. They're lynching the blacks. They're destroying everything they've fought for during the war. It's basically, as Thomas Nast puts it, it's worse than slavery. And the Union wasn't doing nothing against this. What's wrong with the government? You think that's okay? So, things are getting bad in the South at this point. By 1870, it's bad. Well, at the urging of President Ulysses S. Grant, who won the election in 1868, Johnson was not going to win, and he won the election. He took office in 1869. And mind you, that Grant had been the main winning U.S. Northern general during the Civil War. He had been the one that Lee surrendered to. So he was like the big hero. In 1871, Congress passes several legislation pieces that took direct aim at the KKK and anyone who tries to disrupt black voting rights and their political rights, like citizenship. And due to this, the Klan collapses. Its influence and its power in the South collapses. By the end of 1871, they're done. The first Klan is done. It had been formed in 1866, but it gained power in 1870, really. And it's gone. But, although the KKK are now gone, the white supremacy thought of most white Southerners and former plantation owners is not gone. They still don't want the African American man holding power. And racism is present still in the South during the early 1870s, and it would remain there for over 100 years, and it's still somewhat there today in some parts. Not everyone in the South is racist. Make that very clear. Not everyone in the South is racist. In fact, a majority of them aren't. But there are still a few. But there's still a few in every part of the country. So racism is present in both the North and the South, though. As I mentioned, it's not just the South. There's prejudice against African Americans in the North. And because of this, many Republican officials, they start becoming more conservative. Like they are now. They're not very stoic, and they're starting to go to their own little weird political beliefs. Well, Democrats start gaining control in the southern state governments. And they start advocating for the removal of the federal troops. Because of the blacks kind of not wanting to vote, they're still afraid to. Federal Republicans are starting to not support them as much, and Democrats are starting to gain control again in the South. after an economic depression hits in 1874, and this hits the South especially hard because of the fact that their economy is already ruined, the Democrats won the House of Representatives for the first time since before the Civil War. And because the Democrats start inciting campaigns of violence against Southern leaders, Southern Republican leaders, and African Americans. And it gets to the point that they're having to call federal troops in to try to suppress these violent uprisings. Well, President Grant, in 1875, the governor of Mississippi calls for troops. President Grant realizes there's just not any support anymore for more federal troops to be sent to try to police the South because people are growing tired of it. And he refuses to send the additional troops, and this marks the death knell of Reconstruction. It wasn't, many people blame Grant for it, and may I point, Grant did what he could. He didn't end Reconstruction because he wanted to. It's just there wasn't support from the population anymore. And if he did it, he would have faced political backlash. He would have faced every bit of backlash from the people. The people just didn't want to do it anymore, which I think is a failing of the United States citizens as a whole. Anyway, in case you don't know who Ulysses S. Grant was, here he is. He was the main winning general during the Civil War for the North, and he was also our 18th president. He served 2 terms. He was president from 1869 until 1877. Well, by 1876, we are now 11 years after the end of the Civil War. The only states that still had Republican governments and not Democratic ones are Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The Democrats have gained control. By that point, they've gained control of almost every one of the southern states except for those 3. And there's now no more support for Reconstruction era governments from the national government, which is going to be a big mistake. In 1876, the presidential election comes, and it's actually quite contested. And the southern states and the Southern Democrats start advocating that they will threaten to secede again if the one candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, who's a Republican, is elected. And it gets ugly. The race gets very ugly. And eventually, it's so close of an electoral tie that they want to declare Hayes the winner, but they wonder what's going to happen with the South should they do so. So Hayes kind of makes a compromise with the Southern Democrats. In this compromise, he would exchange one thing for the other. And that is, is willing to exchange that if the Southern Democrats certify his election as president, he will acknowledge the Democratic control of the South, and he will withdraw all the remaining federal troops in the South. This is 1876 of the election. Of course, the Southern Democrats readily agree, and after he takes office in March of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th president, takes and removes the federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. Reconstruction is now done. This is a picture of Hayes. So that is the end of Reconstruction. With the withdrawal of federal troops, the southern states are no longer being enforced. It's no longer being enforced in the southern states to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. They have acknowledged the 13th, but they're hesitant to acknowledge the 14th and 15th. And because of this, that's where things are going to start going wrong. They're going to start implementing restrictions again on blacks in what we call Jim Crow laws or segregation. And that's really going to continue here for the next century. But I'm not going to really delve into that right now because of the factor that is a whole separate topic, and I actually want to do that in the next video to give it proper devotion of time. So we will cover that in our upcoming 3rd video for this series, which will be about Jim Crow laws and segregation, which is the next chapter that we got to follow. And then after that, we get to civil rights in the 1960s that will finally gain African Americans every right that they should have gotten and they deserved. So in hindsight, if we look here, Reconstruction, kind of bad. I mean, it started out good. It started out with meaningful purpose. But by the end of it, it's failed to live up to what it was going to accomplish, set out to accomplish to do. The South was being readmitted, but the white supremacist views in the South of the former plantation owners against their former slaves is not gone. It's still there. And because of this, segregation and racist policies in the South again take root. They cannot have slavery, but they're going to do everything they can to restrict their rights and their activities. A very sad chapter that we had to cover. So we will continue with the series in the third video, which will probably be this coming next week. If I'm lucky, I might do it this weekend. This depends when I can get around to it. It's a little bit busy right now for me. So we will get around to that. So the third video will be on Jim Crow laws and segregation, which will cover roughly from 1877 up to the 1940s. So we will cover that. And that is all for this video. So if you have any comments in the section below, leave them in the section below if you have any comments. If you have any suggestions for history topics, be sure to let me know. I'm still open to doing some. In fact, if I were to get one, I would add it on along with what we're doing. So I will be more than happy to still take them. But again, list comments, like, subscribe to the channel, like the videos. I will provide a little thing here at the end to the Abraham Lincoln assassination video, as I mentioned previously, that I done back in April. So I will include that. So that is all for this video. Hope everyone has a continued good rest of their week, and we will see you all back here hopefully when the third video comes out.